Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tenpenny Files. I'm your host, Dr. Sherri Tenpenny. On the Tenpenny Files, this is more than just an interview show. I hold daily conversations with guests whose research reveals evidence that challenges the mainstream headlines that you so commonly hear. Topics span from national government and history and astronomy and travel to food and fitness to health policy. And of course, we talk about vaccines. I also introduce you to authors who have taken a deep dive into faith and biblical principles. So I want to introduce you to topics that you've never heard of before, or perhaps you've always wanted to take the time to explore and, of course, never had the time. For listeners ready to question stories that they've been told, the Tenpenny Files is the show for you. Join me here every day at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, to hear from authors and documentary filmmakers who have something important to say but have been silenced or censored. Now, before I introduce you to today's guest, I want to encourage all of my listeners to become a Tenpenny Prime member. You will benefit from a white paper, from a recorded presentation, and a monthly Ask the Expert masterclass with live interactions. You can go to primembership.drtenpenny.com and click on the membership tab to find more and hopefully to join us. So with that, today's conversation is with my guest and dear friend that we've known each other a long time. We're growing old together here,
Yeah.
Andy Wakefield, to talk about his journey from physician to author to filmmaker. Andy, thank you so much for joining us here today on the show.
Sherri, it's great to be with you. Thank you so much.
Tell us, for people who don't know you, they've probably been living under a rock for the last 20 years. But I think that a lot of people in our sector, our health freedom sector that talk about vaccines and autism and things like that, know you extremely well and know your journey. But there may be people outside of that in this new scope of this platform we are that don't know much about your journey. So why don't you tell us a bit about how you started as a conventional medical doctor, and how you became a filmmaker.
Yes, yeah, but delighted to give you a potted summary. I graduated in medicine in 1981 from St Mary's Hospital in London, one of six generations of my family to graduate from that medical school. And so medicine was in my blood. I became a gastrointestinal surgeon with a specific interest in inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis. And these were epidemic diseases for which we didn't know the cause. And I made some interesting observations. Calling them discoveries is a little ambitious, but some observations and changed the thinking on Crohn's disease. And so in 1990, I started considering Crohn's disease not to be a bowel disease, that may sound like heresy, but a blood vessel disease, a disease of the tiny blood vessels that supply the bowel, and that compromising the blood supply to the bowel led to the idiosyncratic features of Crohn's, which it explained. It was fascinating. We did a whole series of studies that showed that. And the question for me, and this is relevant now to COVID, it's really interesting, is I was looking at the cells that line blood vessels and their procoagulant and anticoagulant activity. So a blood vessel, the lining of the blood vessel normally produces anticoagulants that allow the blood to flow freely. Well, when you get a viral infection, for example, of those blood vessels, that can change and clots start forming and the blood supply is compromised and the tissue dies as a consequence. So I was particularly interested in measles and looked at measles and found evidence for measles in Crohn's disease. And that was really interesting, and went on with a Swedish group to show that mothers who'd had measles during pregnancy had an extraordinarily high rate of pregnancies that then gave birth to a child that later in life developed severe Crohn's disease. So was some unusual timing, something unusual about exposure to measles, because measles in pregnancy was vanishingly rare. Everybody had had it as children, that then it produced a different outcome, a different long-term outcome. Now, then we said, and this is where the trouble started, well, why are we seeing an epidemic of Crohn's in children? We never saw it in children. The peak age of onset was 30 years of age. Now we were seeing babies with Crohn's disease, unheard of before. And so we wondered whether measles vaccine, the single measles vaccine, as a very unusual pattern of exposure, completely unlike the natural infection, whether that was a trigger. And we did a study which looked at two groups of individuals, one that got natural measles, one that got the vaccine, and lo and behold, the rate of Crohn's was 3 times higher in the ones who got the vaccine. We published that in the Lancet, and the trouble began. And the trouble began in the form of mothers, very smart, intelligent mothers who came to me and said, Dr. Wakefield, my child was absolutely fine until they had the MMR, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, and then they lost all their skills. They became autistic. I said, stop, you must have got the wrong doctor because I know nothing at all about autism. We weren't taught about it at medical school, so rare. 1 in 10,000. I didn't even know that. I doubt I could even spell it at the time. And they said, no, the reason we're calling you is that my child has intractable bowel problems and no one will take them seriously. And I'm sure they're related to their autism. When this is bad, this is bad. And it came on at the same time. And I know my child's in terrible pain. They can't speak. They've lost the ability to speak, but I know they're in pain. And so the story was so coherent and so consistent across a large group of parents that we decided to investigate these children, put together a big team of eminent physicians, the world's leading pediatric gastroenterologist, John Walker Smith, and we scoped these children, and yes, absolutely, the parents were right. The children had an inflammatory bowel disease. It was milder than Crohn's. It wasn't the same as ulcerative colitis. It was different. But they had a disease. And the fascinating thing was when we treated that disease, then not only would the bowel get better, but the behavior would improve and they'd start speaking. They'd start using words they hadn't used for 5 years. It wasn't just that the child was feeling better. It was something cognitively had changed, like some sort of block had been lifted. It was fascinating. So since the parents were right on all these things and the medical profession had been completely wrong to a man and a woman, we had an absolute moral obligation to take their story seriously about the vaccine. And that's when it really started to hit the skids. And the dean of the medical school took me aside and said, if you continue this vaccine safety research, it will not be good for your career. I received similar threats from elsewhere. And I guess I was young and I was a surgeon and it made me angry. I thought, what about the patients? And so I stuck with it. And yes, it wasn't good for my career. So I eventually, to cut a very long and painful story short, I came to America as a professional and political exile. Couldn't work ever again in England. They called me all kinds of things: fraud, liar, cheat, abuser, everything they could come up with. Nowadays, everybody knows about this, the cancel culture, how to destroy a physician in 5 minutes, which is easy to do. With COVID, some of the best doctors in the world, Peter McCullough is a classic example. His career gone overnight because he criticized the mainstream narrative and the vaccine. So, but in those days, it was pretty much unheard of. So I was kind of standing there in a force 10 hurricane and wondering quite what was going on. So I came to this wonderful country, and believe me, I love America. You have to come, it's almost as if you have to come from somewhere else and experience the oppression and the lack of freedom to appreciate what an extraordinary country this is. And so I've become a great patriot. I love this country. And I came to Texas, which is, fits with my mentality, my thinking, my sort of determination to get the job done, and worked here, set up a center. They came after me here. I thought, okay, I have no career. I'll have to invent a new one. I have to come up with something else. I have to be creative. And people had come to me over the years from industry, from federal agencies like the Department of Health or the CDC, and said, we've done a terrible thing, and here is the evidence. Whistleblowers. And so I became a kind of repository for whistleblowers, some great stories, and I would then hand them on to public interest lawyers to see whether they had legal merit. But I thought these would make wonderful films. And so I became a filmmaker. I started in 2004. I started screenwriting and being a boff like you and reading everything and doing all. I um I went on all the courses and read all the books and studied and studied and studied. And then I did the same with direction. I got into directing and love that. So I made 6 films now, all very much in the same vein. Four documentaries. The last one with Bobby Kennedy on infertility vaccines, and then after that, 2 narrative feature films. One about COVID, which has just been we finished in Thailand, shot it in Thailand, and that will be coming out, I should think, in the first quarter of the new year. So yes, an interesting career. There were several ups and downs, more downs at times than ups. But um, I've met some extraordinary people, including yourself, along the way. So what a treasure that is, and I feel that at the very least, I didn't walk away in the heat of battle, and continued to do what I trained to do as a doctor.
I think I've shared this with you before, but I'm going to say it again. I remember so clearly. Actually, I actually wrote a couple of articles on it years ago. It was back in 2002. You and I were both speaking at a conference in Dallas, and the conference, and after the conference, there was a fundraiser, because that's when your mischief was really just getting started. And so there was a fundraiser, and for you and some of the things that were happening, and also for the organization that was hosting the event. And I'll never forget you saying that, we are here for the children. And those of us that are on the front line, if we lay down the flag when the going gets a little rough, and you sort of chuckled and said, I know a little bit about getting rough. And that was just when it was starting. If we lay down the flag and don't continue to fight for these children, who would ever come along behind us and pick up that flag? And that, you saying that, has been an inspiration for me my entire career of doing this, because you're right. And now, I've been doing this 25 years, and in the beginning, it was just a few of us, but now there's more and more, and your films have made a big difference, and what you've written, the books, and both of us speaking out at conferences and doing all these things to let people know what the disasters have, what vaccine disasters have actually caused. So, publicly and in front of everybody who's listening here, I want to thank you for being an inspiration to me for 25 years to carry on, because we got to keep moving. Now there's more people that are coming along behind us. And I think they overplayed their hand with COVID, and people really now understand the disasters of our government, our healthcare system, the lies of our public health department. That I think that finally that was the thing that cracked open everybody's heads, and they kind of see it now. But your journey, I think your one book, you said, I think I heard you say recently, it's maybe being optioned for a film about your life and about all the things you went through?
Yes, yes, it was optioned a little while ago, and I'm waiting to see what's going to happen with it. It's yes, one of those things I'd love to stay away from. You don't really ever want to go near a film that's being made about you. You've got to allow the filmmaker the freedom to do what they creatively want to do, and it's very easy to, oh no, it wasn't quite like that, and no, I wouldn't have worn, stay away from that kind of thing and just let them get on with it.
You said that you were, what did you say, sixth or seventh generation physician in your
Sixth
family?
generation, in fact, 7 now. I'm a new generation, a young generation now.
What does your relatives say while you were going through all of these really terrible trials and all the things that were going on? What did your medical relatives have to say about that?
Well, my father and mother were supportive throughout. I mean, they really believed. And one of the great sadnesses of my one, not a regret, but just a fact of life, is that I would love us to be where we are now when my father was still alive. When we're seeing it all turn around, when we're seeing the truth emerge. And he really took this to heart. It made him very, very sad to see this happen. And he died before there was any resolution. My mother, on the other hand, is 95 and going strong and is aware of it. It knows that all these things are happening and Bobby Kennedy's in the White House and things. So she's seeing the sort of reconciliation or the redemption, if you like, to what extent that's taking place. So the rest of them, very conservative, great believers in the system and trusters and trusting in the vaccines. So we never really talked about it. But my brother, who is a surgeon, very good surgeon, my younger brother, came to a talk I gave in the UK the other day, kicking and screaming, but he came and he was, you're never quite the same afterwards when you realized that, what you're talking about is valid and has been borne out. And yeah, a mixed bag.
Mixed thing. I imagine that would be like that in anybody's family, particularly if you've got relatives who are still deeply entrenched in the system, in the conventional way of thinking, and vaccines are good and pharmaceuticals are better. It's all those sorts of things. What do you think of this happening now in our government with all of these measles outbreaks and trying to create all this hysteria over pertussis and things like that? What do you say from a position of kind of standing outside the circle looking in now?
Right. In terms of measles, and this goes for those other common childhood infections as well, that we vaccinate against or try and vaccinate against. I think that firstly, let me start by saying wherever we are in the world right now in terms of measles and vaccine uptake, it is entirely at the door of public health. We are here in this parlous situation at the moment because of public health, not because of you and me speaking on this show or any other thing that we've done. It is down to them. The world is confused and uncertain because of the failures of public health, because adequate safety studies were not done when they should have been done before these vaccines were licensed and put into children. And therefore, they have only themselves to blame for where we are. Now, what do we do about measles outbreaks? People say, well, what would you do now? What would you do now? Expecting you to have to say, get children vaccinated. But here's the thing. Let's just go back to that California outbreak in whenever that was. What turned up 4 years later, and I was following it, and I could not find anything until 4 years later when they showed that 43% of those cases in California, in fact, in the States at the time, were caused by the vaccine strain of the virus. They didn't tell us that at the time, even though they probably had that information. They did not want us to know. Because how do you ever eradicate an infection or stop an epidemic when nearly half of the cases are actually being caused by the vaccine? So there has not been honesty with the public about you can never eradicate an infection where what you're giving to prevent it or try and prevent it is actually causing it. You will never do it. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is that with these old vaccines, the live viral vaccines, we're seeing increasing resistance, just like we saw with antibiotic resistant bacteria. We're seeing the emergence of resistant so-called declayed strains of this virus in intensively vaccinated countries that are not producing immunity that is going to get rid of any infection or control any infection. So there is a problem, and they are going to have to deal with that. The other is, and this is extremely important, is that the vaccine does not induce the same immunity that natural infection induces. And that's a problem. And it was pointed out as a problem by Enders, the Nobel Prize winner Enders, Dr. Enders from Harvard, who discovered the measles virus. He said, if you give a vaccine that doesn't produce the same immune profile as the natural infection, then you've got problems. Well, when it was introduced, that's what was promised. infection, one vaccination will give you immunity for life, that it won't alter the age of any measles susceptibility, that there'll be no side effects like encephalitis, so on and so forth. None of those were true. They were all false. And now we're in a situation where mothers do not confer adequate immunity on their babies during the first year of life. So their babies are no longer protected, where that was a perfect element of natural herd immunity, was maternal immunity conferred upon the baby transplacentally and in breast milk. That doesn't happen anymore. And so babies under one are susceptible to measles when they cannot have a vaccine. So they've caused huge problems by overcommitting, overpromising, and failing to deliver. And then the other element of that, and this is very interesting, and I've never seen this addressed. I'll just hold this up, if I may, to the camera. People can see this. And this is from a blood donation center in Boca Raton. It's a study that came out, and no one's dared mention it since, although I've talked about it. And this looks at neutralizing antibodies induced by measles and measles vaccine in measles vaccine recipients, 1 and 2 doses. The neutralizing antibodies that are produced are meant to be those antibodies that neutralize the measles virus. They're the ones that are crucial for immunity. Now, what happens when they take blood from people who donated way back that they've stored? They donated way back when measles was prevalent, and then when the introduction of the first shot, the second shot, and where we are now. And this is the neutralizing antibody titers. Here is when people had measles. All these years later, we see that there is very high antibody levels. These go down dramatically in the face of vaccine here. This is the single shot, and then over here, the double shot, the booster shot. The levels have disappeared, and with the booster, they go even lower. So what we're looking at is a population that has no neutralizing antibody immunity to measles virus, in spite of being doubly or triply vaccinated. That's a very worrying situation.
When did that study get published, or when
I
did?
can send you, I can send you this so that you can give it to your anyone there. This is, let me just put my glasses on. Another problem with old age. This is from the Oxford University Press, Journal of Infectious Diseases, Volume 216, October 2017. I'll send you this.
Pretty recent.
If anyone's interested, they can check all the source data. And that is very alarming because it suggests we have a population now that should some rogue strain of measles come along, we have no neutralizing antibody with which to protect ourselves. That's alarming. And I'm astonished that I've never heard public health address this issue, replicate the study, deal with it. So,
I found a study that was published, I believe, in around 1997, that they looked at the antibodies in breast milk. And I think it was the only one that they've ever done, or they've done nothing since that. It was way back when I was researching this. And they found that the antibodies that came across the breast milk, and they were comparing vaccinated women compared to women who had had natural measles. And they think they did this study in Africa because there's more natural measles floating around out there. And they found that the ones that had been vaccinated, that the antibodies were not, there weren't very many of them. And the ones that they did have were not very effective compared to the mothers that had natural measles. They had very robust antibodies that went through to the infant and higher concentrations, which goes along with what you just said. And that's another thing they haven't repeated and looked at, is what is supposed to happen when a mother gets natural measles and passes that on to their baby, as you were saying.
yeah, it's a real concern, and it's a consequence. It's because of vaccination.
Yeah.
And in spite of it, it's because of vaccination. We've created this situation. We've created a vulnerable profile. We have identified something that Dr. Enders all those years ago said, be very, very careful about what you're doing. This is the man who discovered the virus, telling the NIH and the CDC, be very careful. You do not know what you're doing. And we realize now that we're in this crazy situation precisely because public health made assumptions. I remember I spoke to David Salisbury. He was in the UK in the Department of Health in charge of vaccination. And I said to him, what safety studies, because I can't find them, did you do to compare the safety of the single measles vaccine versus the safety of the combined measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, a combination that the body had never seen ever before in its entire history? What studies did you do? Because I can't find them. I must be missing them and doing you a disservice. And he said, we had no reason to assume that the safety profile of the triple vaccine would be any different to the single. If you are going to give a so-called preventative procedure to every child in the country, and by extension, every child in the world, you do not make assumptions. You do not make assumptions on behalf of the entire population of the globe. Because if you get it wrong, you get it wrong for a long time. And I remember the same sort of story when they said, when we injected the COVID shot, we thought it would remain at the site of injection. And they told people that, and they reassured people on that basis. And then it turned out it went everywhere. The brain, the ovaries, the testes, everywhere. They were completely and utterly wrong. And when they got it wrong, by the time they got it wrong, and all those people had been given the shot, it was too late. It was too damn late. Never make assumptions about the safety of something like vaccines on behalf of the population. You haven't been elected, and you certainly haven't been appointed to do that. So we're in this situation because of their inadequacy, of their shortcomings, of their almost kindergarten-like approach to public health.
Well, absolutely. And that's a good place for us to hold that thought right there, Andy, because we're going to need to take a short break to hear from our sponsors of AmericaOutloud.news. America Out Loud Talk Radio plays the Tenpenny Files on the iHeartRadio network every day, Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. If you've missed any of these great conversations, you can find the Tenpenny Files on Spotify, Pandora, Apple, TuneIn, iHeart Virtual Studios, and my platform at dr10penny.com. We also play them on X and on Rumble and on my Substack, which is dr10penny.substack.com. Because there's so many books and so many great documentaries and so little time to read and to watch, this show is meant to maximize your time and jumpstart your interest. We've got some great messages coming from our sponsors that keep us on this show and to keep America Out Loud going. Please listen to these closely. And if something sparks your interest, please buy from us. And we'll be right back with more of the story from Andy Wakefield, physician, author, and filmmaker. We will be right back. Zeolite is a detox spray. We work specifically with a company called Touchstone Essentials. They are an incredible company. We've been working with them now for several years. And zeolite is a mineral that goes through your body like a one-way basket. It will clean out heavy metals such as arsenic and mercury, aluminum, cadmium, and it hooks onto those metals from a one-way perspective. So once it's bound, it goes out through your urine or your stools and doesn't get redeposited in other places. Everybody needs to have a detox product in their life, and this one is so easy to use and it's so safe. You can take it when you're pregnant, you can take it when you're nursing, you can give it to little children, you can even give it to infants, and quite frankly, I give it to my dog. I actually put a little bit of the zeolite in his water because until we all stop living in a toxic world, we all need to get some of those extra toxicities out, the heavy metals, the persistent organic pollutants, the things that are floating through the air, the different things that we come in touch with in our environment. And we are a big fan of zeolite from Touchstone Essentials. We've been a big fan of their products for several years. Go to dr10penny.com/detox to get your first bottle of zeolite spray for $50 off.
Well, only when the government bows to the people will America become great again. This is Malcolm Out Loud here. Join me in pushing back against censorship, my fellow Americans. Right at the top of AmericaOutloud.news are the words, many voices, one freedom, united in the First Amendment. Now is our time, my fellow Americans. AmericaOutloud.news. Liberty and justice for all.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Today, we're talking with Andy Wakefield about his journey from being a physician to a filmmaker. Let me tell you just a little bit more about Andy Wakefield, who I've known for more than 20 years now. I just love him. You're just such a great friend and such a mentor to me. Andy Wakefield graduated from as a fellow from the Royal College of Surgeons in 1985. He's published over 150 scientific articles, books, book chapters, and invited to scientific commentaries. In his pursuit to discover the links between childhood vaccines, intestinal inflammation, and neurological injury in children, he lost his job, his medical license, his career, and his country. Then he reinvented himself to be a great filmmaker. And over the last 10 years, he's produced 5 films and a 6th one that is soon to be on its way. And he's also working on another new movie project. And I really hope that they will make his life story into a documentary, because it is worthy to be put on the big film and watched forever. Andy, what do you think about, you and I both know Bobby Kennedy, Secretary Kennedy, from the time he was just Bobby Kennedy to us. What do you think about what he's doing at HHS on the issue of vaccine safety? Do you think he's ever going to be able to really pull it off and make changes?
He definitely is making changes. The first thing to do is characterize his circumstances at the moment. And so he is in one of the toughest positions in the entire organization, in the entire government, because what he has is people on both sides of the aisle whose campaign funds come largely from the pharmaceutical companies. So there is huge lobbying pressure on them and then on him to cease and desist, to stop doing what he's doing. And despite that, he's still doing it. So it's not just coming from the Democrats, it's coming from the Republicans and everyone else as well. And he is doing, in my opinion, he's doing a wonderful job. Yes, there are other things he could be doing. But he's making big changes, and I fully support him. I think, who could have imagined a year and a half ago us being in this situation? We've been in this a very long time, Sherri, and even though we remain pathologically optimistic, we could not have anticipated such a dramatic change. So a great appointment. Here's the thing: in order to be able to carry through on what he's doing, he needs to be put in that same position again in 3 years' time, because it's a long-term agenda. He needs to get the studies out there that show people that what he's been saying is valid, what parents have been saying is valid, what you and I have been saying is valid, and thereby persuade other people within the government infrastructure that changes need to be made. So he's doing, I'm delighted that he's there. I think he's doing a wonderful job, but he needs to have another term. And I don't care what else you care about. This is our issue, and therefore the Republicans need to take the government again to allow Bobby Kennedy, if that's all it does, allow Bobby Kennedy to complete his mission. That's absolutely essential. Why? Because you and I know that human beings are a very reactionary species. And if he does not get in for a second term in that position as head of HHS, we will see the pendulum swing back dramatically.
Harder.
Lobbyists will be swarming all over Capitol Hill from the pharmaceutical companies, and we will go back. It will be worse than it was before. Such is the nature of mankind. So we have to take a very long-term view of what he's trying to do and encourage him to continue.
I couldn't agree with you more. I absolutely 1,000% agree with that, because not only is he up against government, senators and Congress people who get so much money from pharma, he's also taken on big food and big ag at the same time too. And we have some little no-name judge out there somewhere in I think Kentucky or West Virginia that said that he's going to put a block on removing food additives from foods. I mean, I mean, the American, people are just like, come on, you got to be kidding me. And then he's also up against the 100 million people or so in this country that still believe vaccines are the best thing since sliced bread and perforated toilet paper, that they're safe and effective and necessary. And, all of our kids are going to die if they don't have them. So he's got a lot of battles. And so I always, when I talk about Bobby, I say, I always pray for him every day. I put him on my prayer list to pray for his wisdom and to pray for his safety, because these people, they don't always play nice and don't in a really bad way. So with all that's happening in ACIP right now, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, do you think we're approaching the tipping point on this vaccine schedule?
Yes, I do. I honestly do. As I say, we couldn't have imagined we'd be in this position. When I first got involved, and when you got involved, there were probably 5 to 10 physicians worldwide prepared to even address the thorny issue of vaccine safety. Now, more than half the adult population of the world are talking about vaccine safety because of COVID. You made the point, and COVID has changed everybody's. It's the biggest mistake they ever made, and it has turned people lock, stock, and barrel against public health. They don't trust experts anymore. They don't trust the system, and they're quite right not to. The system has only got itself to blame. Tony Fauci, Peter Dowd, these people who only got themselves to blame. They've created this situation, but it has played into the hands of those activists, those parents who've been out there for years making the case that vaccines are problematic. So I think, are we beyond the tipping point? Yes, it's unstoppable. You can't hold back the tide of truth. And as the science that Bobby's sponsoring comes through, I think we're going to see that more and more. I was just on a paper with Nick Hulscher and Peter McCullough, and I was invited to be on a scientific paper all these years after I was last on a paper. I was astonishing. I was almost respectable. But, when I got involved in this all those years ago in the Lancet, I wrote, this does not prove vaccines cause autism. Further research is needed to establish whether or not this is the case. Well, this study, that further research has now been done. Here it is, a conclusion looking at 136 papers that purport to address this issue. And it's a wonderful piece of scholarship. And I made some minor contributions, but the conclusion: combination and early timed routine childhood vaccination constitutes the most significant modifiable risk factor for autism spectrum disorder. Excuse me, Terry. In other words, it can be prevented. It's the greatest modifiable risk factor. So there it is. The science has been done, and it's now a matter of reinforcing that science, but it's time for decisions. It's time for action.
I just watched a short little video someone sent me this morning about the Simpson-Wood hearings. That was 30 years ago now?
Yeah.
25 years ago. And for the audience that may not know that, it was a closed door group of CDC officials and people from Merck and they held this offsite meeting and saw that how much thimerosal, mercury, were in the vaccines, and what the large doses of mercury that children were getting when they got multiple vaccines on one day. And the larger the amount of mercury that was injected into their body, the more severe their neurological problems were, which should be like a brainless conclusion, because the only place in the world where mercury is considered safe is in vaccines and in your mouth, in amalgam fillings. Everywhere else in the world, it's not. And they hid that data. They didn't try to dispute it. They just hid it for all of these years. And so I think people are now since Bobby's taken mercury out of the flu shots, which is like the way that they introduced it back into the schedule in 2004, when they were told to take all the mercury out, they took it out of all the mercury, they loaded it up with aluminum, and then they instituted back in the flu shots at 6-month-old babies, the mercury thing. So all of these historical things that we've known about for decades and have all been out there. Hundreds. I mean, at one point in time, I don't keep it up anymore because the person who worked for me doesn't work for me anymore. I had over 17,000 articles from mainstream medical journals that showed problems associated with vaccines. And it was infuriating to me that people kept saying, we need more studies, we need more studies. I said, how many more do you need than 17,000? Wouldn't 1,700 have been enough? Or, wouldn't that have been a good? But they're continuing to really clamor for that. Is this just a way to shut people up by to say, we don't have enough research, we need to do more studies?
Well, let me give you, this is fascinating. You may well know this, but it's something I'd love to talk about films, but this is such an important thing. I'd love to just share this with you. This is from the Federal Register, so a government document. It's written by Mark Novich in '84, and it's he was head of the FDA at that time, and it's talking about the polio virus, but it reflects the system's attitude to science in the context of all vaccines and public health policy. And it says this: any possible doubts, whether or not well founded, about the safety of the vaccine cannot be allowed to exist. In view of the need to assure that the vaccine will continue to be used to the maximum extent consistent with the nation's public health objectives.
Wow.
Cannot be allowed to exist. That's what we're up against. That's why they are still talking about 17,000, because it cannot be allowed to exist. In their minds, it doesn't matter what you write, it doesn't matter how common the adverse reaction is, how serious, how many children are injured. It doesn't matter. It cannot be allowed to exist because it's going to affect our public health objectives. Not the children, but the public health objectives. So that is what we've been up against. And that's why we are in this extraordinary situation that we're in now. They have created this, and it's deeply concerning.
When Bobby came out and said something about that, like 76% of children now have chronic diseases, we made this little meme that sort of made its circulations around. It said, high vaccination rates plus low infection rates equal 76% of children chronically ill. Because it seems as that's all public health cares about. They don't care about all these 76% of kids that have, chronic things like asthma, allergies, eczema, ADD, morbid obesity. All they care about is high vaccination rates and low infection rates. And it's resulted in having 76% of our kids chronically sick. So let's hop back and talk about your films, because that's really what we wanted to really dig into here, because the films you have made, Andy, have made such a huge difference in the world. When you started with Vaxxed, and the 1986, The Act is just such an incredible film. For people that don't know that film, they really should watch it. It's a journey of a husband and wife that they got pregnant, and the wife started questioning vaccines, and they followed down the rabbit hole of how the 1986 Act got passed. And then you have the infertility film that you did with Bobby, and Protocol 7 that won 34 film rewards. I mean, that's amazing. So where are you now with your filmmaking? You said you just finished one in Thailand, but you really haven't said what it's about.
We made a COVID story. We told a COVID story in Thailand, and it was a tragic and fascinating and a story that really was synonymous with the global experience of COVID. I must have been mad to think. So here's the thing. The actors spoke in Thai. I do not speak a word of Thai. So they speak very, very good English, and they read the script and knew their lines very well, but they could have been saying anything. It looked good. It sounded wonderful. The subtitles read the same way as the film reads, but how it will, but we'll never know. We'll talk to our Thai friends when it comes out to see how closely, but what was I thinking? I mean, how ambitious was that, to make a film in a language about which you know nothing at all?
What were you thinking that you decided to do that in Thailand?
Because one of our main sponsors, a lovely man, lives in Thailand. He's a German businessman, and he'd experienced the story personally. And it meant so much to him that he asked, would you make this film? And of course, the answer is yes. And so we all went off to Thailand and made this film. The girl who played the lead role, young girl, was absolutely outstanding. I mean, it was a joy to direct these actors. They were superb. And she in particular stood out. She has a wonderful career. So now the next film is something I'd love to talk about because, okay, here's the backstory. It's not a vaccine story. The greatest fear for any parent with a vaccine injured child with autism in particular is, and this is pervasive, it's the one that if you ask parents, it's the one that haunts them, that keeps them awake at night. What happens to my child when I become infirm or die? What happens then? Because there's no one out there who cares for them, who understands their problem, or who loves them, and they will die on the street. And there are millions and millions of such individuals out there at the moment whose parents are suffering this nightmare as they get older and older and older. Some years ago, I was at an autism conference, and a mother who had a profoundly affected child asked me if I would father a child for her. Now, you may think, what a strange thing to ask, and what an even stranger thing to tell me on a show. But she wasn't interested in sex with me, Sherri. She wanted to give birth to a healthy, unvaccinated child who could grow up to look after her profoundly injured son when she died. And her motive was so sincere, so moving, so inspiring that I decided to turn it into a story, a screenplay. A story about the lengths a mother will go to protect her child, about maternal instinct, about a love story. And it's actually a Western. It's not about it, because my concern was this. I think, as we've mentioned already in this show, the vaccine story is now turning. We need to work very hard and continue to work hard, but we're beyond the tipping point. It will change if we keep the momentum going. What about all those children who are left on the battlefield in man's quest to conquer infectious disease? What about all those injured individuals? What will happen to them? What care will there be for them? And so my desire, this film was, if it's the last thing I do on this planet, I want to bring attention to the plight of those individuals and wake the world up, as only film can, to the urgent need to address this issue. And so it's a Western set on the Yukon Trail back in the 1860s, and one of the harshest environments in the world as snow and attacks from Native Americans and disease and indifference, sort of. And so that's the background to it. And if we're putting it all together, the scripts there, if anyone out there, anyone listening is interested in coming on board, not as a donor, but as an investor, I feel, things have changed in my filmmaking career. I want people to be able to anticipate a benefit to their contribution if they're taking a risk on a film. So if is anyone out there who would like to consider being an investor in this film, we'd love to have you on board, love to speak to you. So info@wakefieldmediagroup.com. And if you want to see the movies that are out there now, then wakefieldmediagroup.com is the place to go.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad that you're doing this film, because it's not, there's another set of silenced people that nobody has ever talked about that I know of, really. And it's the siblings of these severely vaccine injured people, that from the time they were growing up, that their favorite toys got smashed and all the attention was on this injured child. And they were just like the silent, observers on the side. And I don't know that anybody has ever really talked about them or addressed that, what it was like to be a sibling of a severely vaccine injured child, severe autism, they're adults and still wearing diapers and can't feed themselves, can't bathe themselves. I mean, people really don't understand. Autism is a big word. It covers a lot of different types of dysfunction, and that unless you have spent time with these children, you don't understand what autism is all about. And so that's another thing I would put a bug in your ear about for your film after the film, that maybe to look at, because it's not only siblings of severely vaccine injured kids, but it's siblings of maybe a child that had cancer, a child that had, some other really terrible disability, that they were the center focus of the family from financially and all sorts of things. What happened to the rest of those kids? How did they learn to adapt and overcome, or didn't they? Nobody really knows.
Yeah, and it's so pervasive, isn't it? The whole family are affected. The whole family unit is disrupted by the diagnosis of autism in one child. And there's a huge price to pay that really is not evident to the public because people don't, by and large, tend to come out.
Exactly. Well, Andy Wakefield, we have 1 minute left. What would you like to leave with our audience today?
I would like to thank the mothers in particular for the invaluable insights that they've given me into this whole world of autism. And you were right, and you were right because you trusted your instincts, and that is a very, very powerful force. So please don't allow that to be usurped by the man or woman in the white coat. Trust those instincts because they've served us as a species. They've served us extremely well. And perhaps God's greatest gift to mankind is the power of maternal instinct.
Absolutely.
Trust in yourselves.
Well, thank you, Andy, for all the work, everything that you've been through. I really hope they do make a movie about your life, because it's worth always being there as an inspiration to all of us. So, and that I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank all of our members, all of our regular listeners that come to the Tenpenny Files every day at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on AmericaOutloud.news or iHeartRadio. And with that, I want to close with one of my favorite verses from the Bible. I close all of my podcasts with, whether they are live or pre-recorded, which is Romans 12:12. Rejoice in hope, be patient in trouble, and be persistent in prayer. So we'll see you again tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern, or we'll see you the next time right here on the Tenpenny Files. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Goodbye and God bless.